So how does that affect us in Islam? Well, recently one of the scholars of Islam asked three leading muftis, one from Syria, one from Pakistan, and one from Yemen, the following question: are we as individuals answerable for the environment? The answer was not only yes, but as individuals we're obligated to do something about it. So as Muslims, we are obligated to do something about the environment. And I think it goes without saying that the Prophet ﷺ would definitely have been a major advocate of environmental friendliness for not just banks but for all corporations. So we're just going to close with 5 things we can do now, and I've just been joined by Yusuf Jah, who is alhamdulillah senior Sharia auditor at a major Abu Dhabi Islamic bank. And welcome, Yusuf.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
So before I get into 5 things we can do now, he's going to touch on fractional debt reserve banking and Islamic banking. And after a few minutes of that, we'll just do our 5 things we can do now and go to your questions.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I've come in the midst of the presentation, so forgive me if I sort of go over something you've covered already. But I did pick up that you were keen not to focus on forecasts. So inshallah, I'll try and follow that suit. But basically, obviously, the context we're speaking in today is the context of Islamic finance or its views with regards to interest and the environment. And it's actually something that I think is extremely relevant because for Muslims and non-Muslims, in the sense that many a time you may find people who look at things from the micro perspective with regards to why interest is wrong or whether it is wrong at all. And from a Muslim perspective, when obviously when we read the Quran, we see the shiddatul tahrim, we see the extent that interest is considered something wrong by the wording used with regards to it. It's basically described as literally waging war against God, and ostensibly someone could think that if 2 people are engaging through mutual agreement in an interest transaction, whereby they agree, one's in need of cash credit and the other obviously has the credit, and they agree amongst themselves, what's the big deal? And if anything, it's a huge deal. And just to illustrate that, I think it's often easy when you're on a high cholesterol diet and you're into eating your Indian sweets and fried foods, to think that you're not actually going to get a stroke sometime soon because it hasn't reached critical mass. And really it's the fact that you've not been observant. And similarly, if we just look at the fact that almost all major religious traditions across the board were very strict about their prohibition of usury. If we chart the history of usury, we'll find that it was forbidden in Judaism, in the sense that it was prohibited primarily amongst Jews. We see that the church itself went to the extent through various councils and to the extent of reiterating the definition of the sin of usury as receiving any interest on money, to the extent that amongst their councils, they were a particular council, the Lateran Council, reiterated that if a ruler did not punish anyone committing usury in his realm, he would be excommunicated, even if the ruler himself did not do it. So the question that obviously comes to us is, this is not something that's unique to Islam. It's something that's across most traditional communities, and there were actually several steps by which the institution of interest or usury was actually made legitimate, and it was a gradual process. I mean, the word interest itself comes from the word interesse, which was proposed by someone by the name of Hispanus of Rome, and literally means in between is. And the idea was that basically, if a lender was to give something to the borrower and the borrower was late in repaying the loan, then the lender had a right to get what was in between, as in the period of delay. And this was the first real advocacy for money on money. And there was a whole process by which the interest finally culminated in a redefinition of interest through people like King Henry VIII in England. And interestingly enough, the Catholic Church didn't actually take that route, and the first time the Catholic Church itself was actually questioned with regards to the original doctrine of interest was in 1822, and the clarification never quite came. So the point being that amidst all this history on interest, Islam has somehow retained its prohibition of interest. And Islam has a whole worldview about, obviously, a paradigm with regards to finance, with regards to the function of money. And how would that be relevant to Muslims, and how would that be relevant to non-Muslims? Well, it would be relevant to everyone, because the current paradigm that we're operating in is a mess. The world is basically, based on a lot of people's forecasts and estimations, the paradigm of foreseeable growth is obviously not in conformity with the sustainability of the earth. And this was something alluded to by various economists. For example, E.F. Schumacher in his book Small is Beautiful mentioned that anyone who thinks that the way the economy functions today is bereft of a higher level of values is basically incorrect, because every economic paradigm is based on a higher degree of values, even if that value is no values, i.e. free market, i.e. the invisible hand, that somehow markets regulate themselves. And he said there's something known as meta-economics, and a higher degree of principles. And he advocated way back in the 1970s in his book, Small is Beautiful, he basically advocated that for us to provide a separate degree, a separate paradigm, would inevitably need to come from a religious framework, because the generality of people who would be taking an ethical perspective with regards to economics would generally come from a religious framework. And he wrote a famous landmark chapter in his book called Buddhist Economics, and he went on to say that Buddhism could be replaced by any of the major world religions, amongst which he mentioned Islam. Well, in terms of the current world we live in, the viability of a religious framework, or any framework providing an alternative paradigm, is basically, you would contend, is the Islamic worldview. So how does interest now come into play, or the Islam's injunctions against interest come into play on the broader level? Well, specifically, the specific legalizing of interest, which, as I mentioned, followed a chart, allowed for an entire financial system to evolve. The system by which banks could obviously lend at interest, acting as financial intermediaries, so they take money and they lend money at a profit at interest. This system involves banks will, in order to increase their activities, they were allowed reserve ratios of what's referred to as the fractional reserve system. And this fractional reserve system, coupled with the giving and taking of interest, its primary reason for rising was the legalizing of interest, has led to this systematic growth that we find. And this growth that we find is the direct reason why we're now finding that there's basically environmental damage as a result, because the earth is not able to sustain this growth. So for example, just to give some figures, the UK banking system in about 1971, the entire monetary growth that was there has since been created on a yearly basis. Okay, there's been more money created on a yearly basis than the entire money supply that was used to sustain that economy from recorded history until that point. And as a result, we've seen every summer getting hotter, every winter getting milder. We see that estimates are now saying that more than 1 million species worldwide are likely to be driven to extinction by 2050. Half of the world's tropical and temperate forests are now gone. An estimated 90% of the large predator fish are now gone. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the world, as a result of interest-based financing, is in the midst of a dramatic environmental shift. And this has led to many noted scientists advocating that, some of them even advocating that we're at the point of no return. For example, James Lovelock says that close to 80% of the human race will be wiped out by 2100. Likewise, other commentators noted, such as James Gustav Speth, the former administrator of United Nations Development Programme, has directly said that while we can do many things, the primary source for this growth that's completely attacking the sustainability of the world is the capitalist economy. And he asks what he calls the big question. And he says, how can the operating instructions for the modern world economy be changed so that economic activity both protects and restores the natural world? And this is where Muslims and anyone who's interested in this question would do well to answer, would do well to look at Islamic injunctions to do with interest, and the fact that interest has facilitated the modern banking practice of fractional reserve banking that has led to this disproportionate growth, that has led to systemic economic cycles of boom and bust, that has led to wealth inequality of amazing proportions, whereby you could take the world's 3 richest people and they would have more wealth in terms of the combined GDPs of the 48 poorest countries in the world. So at this point, we'll pause and we'll go for questions.
Thank you, Yusuf, the world's most passionate senior Sharia auditor. Alhamdulillah, he loves his job. So thank you for coming from Abu Dhabi for this on this occasion. 5 things we can do now. We hope you've made the connection between interest-based finance and global warming. Just by virtue of taking your money out of interest-based banks, you prevent harm. And as Muslims and as humans, preventing harm takes precedence over seeking any kind of benefit. So obviously, if you're starving, you're not going to be worried about the garnishing on the food. So it's really important to get your money out of interest-based banks, out of interest-based transactions, and out of interest-based products. And start, in terms of financing, in terms of savings, and in terms of where to keep your money. Start by first opening up an Islamic bank account. If there is not an Islamic bank account in where you live, then try to send your money to an Islamic bank that you can access overseas. And if that's not possible, then ask your conventional bank why they don't have an Islamic subsidiary or haven't started up a separate Islamic bank. In terms of what we can do to our own, as Muslims, our own housekeeping, we should ask the Islamic finance scholars, if we are in a position to do so, to kindly develop a more refined fiqh of the environment, a more refined Islamic jurisprudence of the environment, because at the moment most of us are pawing in the dark, and there is very precious little information about, beyond a little waste is makruh and a lot of waste is haram. We have to operationalize, okay, if I can take a bus, should I take a bus? I took a bus to get here today. It took me an extra half an hour. Was that something that's merely recommended, or is that something that's obligatory given the current situation? So these are the kinds of questions we have to ask ourselves. If it takes me twice the amount of time to go by bus, then am I permitted to take a car? We have to develop a much more refined fiqh of the environment as Muslims, and we seek our guidance from the fuqaha, because we don't just make up the religion as we go along. We have the adab, inshallah, to ask people who know more, as is commanded of us in the Quran. AOFI, the world's leading standard-setting body for Islamic finance standards, the accounting and auditing organization for Islamic financial institutions. AOFI needs to go beyond the basic prohibitions of no alcohol, no pork, interest, weapons, and whatnot. We have to ask ourselves more refined, some more sophisticated questions, such as, is a particular project bad for the environment? Does Somalia need a 6-lane highway, from one end of the country to the other, for instance? Perhaps it does, but we have to ask ourselves, there needs to be a more refined and sophisticated means by which we judge our transactions. So, inshallah, one day a standard from AOFI to add to its existing few dozen standards on various products such as Murabaha and Musharaka and Mudarba a standard on the environment. How bad does it need to be in order to become non-Sharia compliant?